In this episode, we're sculpting a cave environment directly into our landscape, and we're also doing a lot with lighting this episode, including God rays, and last but not least, making it possible that our AI characters can follow us into the cave. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. And in this series, we've covered a lot of stuff in regard to outdoor spaces. Stuff like landscape sculpting, foliage painting, environmental sounds, stuff like that. But we haven't yet covered the equivalent for indoor spaces. So today, we're integrating a cave into our landscape, all part of a single level. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our landscape material such that you can cut a hole in your landscape anywhere you like. And then I'll show you a really simple trick for creating cave ceilings that, quite frankly, should be everywhere, but I haven't seen it. And then we'll sculpt out the rest of the cave. The floors, the walls, the entries, the exits. And the entries and the exits are typically the most difficult because you want them merged perfectly with your landscape. But then after that, we'll start getting into the basics of indoor lighting. And I know I keep saying this in regards to all sorts of things, but I am the furthest thing from a lighting expert. Just like so many other things in this series, I am figuring this out as I go along, but I'm still going to show you all the different lighting settings and what I found to be most useful. And I put the word crepuscular into this slide to make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. But over the next few episodes, my vision is that we're going to develop this cave quite a bit. So today we're starting with the basics, but we're going to get into, for example, Niagara fluids, like we're going to have a standing pool of water and then have water drip into that. And my goal with that water is to make it completely interactable, like make it slosh and splash around. And then after that, we'll get into indoor acoustics, like indoor sound. And then after that, once we're in a good spot with our indoor environment, back into AI. So here are the key concepts today. The first two are all about how to integrate an indoor space with your landscape, and the final three are all about the basics of lighting. And luckily, UE5 does a great job at making it really easy to get decent looking lighting. Not going to be an A+, but at least a B+. So you'll have that by the end of the episode. Let's get to it. So just like as is typical for this series, guys, I've got a link in the description below to the spreadsheet of all the free assets that we're using as part of this series. You could just copy and paste the codes from the spreadsheet directly into Quixel Bridge. You'll find it, just download it at nanite quality. And all I did is I sorted my assets under the Earth quadrant that we started. I think it was back in episode 9. And if you're following along with the series, there are really only 4 new static mesh assets to this series. And I put them all under the Earth quadrant, this massive tundra folder. These right here. But for all the assets that we use this episode, there's just a couple of settings you need to set. So let me go into the static mesh first. So these we're going to use for our floors. And so because of that, they need collision. So if you search for collision, we just need to set collision complexity to use complex collision as simple. And that way we actually use the geometry as it's shaped on the ground. And then the other setting, if I go back to that, if you go into the material, so if you scroll down in the details panel, we need to assign each material a physical material of stone. And we created this back in episode 19 with our footstep effects. So if you got all the assets set up that we're going to use for the cave, then onto our landscape material. So for that, I'll select our landscape. And we got to set up our landscape material to be able to have a hole or multiple holes cut into it. So I'll go into that. And I'll go into the parent material here that we created last episode. So we need to use a brand new node called a landscape visibility mask node. But the problem is we can't hook it up in our present state because we're using material attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncheck use material attributes. But the problem is that breaks the connection, that breaks our whole material. So what I have to do is from what we set up last episode, I'll just zoom out. So this is all the stuff that we set up. From this here, we need to drag out a pin and we need to break material attributes and we need to hook up everything to our actual material. Base color to base color, specular to specular, roughness to roughness, normal to normal, and ambient occlusion to ambient occlusion. Now that landscape visibility mask node, we have to hook it up to our opacity mask here. But the problem is it's grayed out. And the reason is we have to change our material. Instead of a blend mode of opaque, we need to change it to masked. And once we do that, our opacity mask node is available. We can drag out a pin and we can search for landscape visibility mask. And what this allows us to do is to then paint holes into our landscape. So let's apply this. We'll save our landscape material and we are good here. We can close out of both these materials. All right, so now we get to decide where on our landscape we're going to have our cave. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have 2 main entrances and exits into and out of our cave. So one's going to be right here, kind of at the base of the beach, closest to the mountain. And the other one I'm going to have on the other side, maybe about right Got to find a low place, maybe about right here. But I'm also going to have a couple of holes up top because I kind of want to have light shafts of light like kind of beaming into the cave. I want the cave to be relatively naturally lit. So the way we're going to paint a hole from our landscape is we got to go into landscape mode. And then within sculpt, we have an option for visibility. And I don't want a brush size of 3000. Let me bring that down maybe to 100. And then wherever you want the hole, you just left click, paint. And actually, I don't want it going into the beach like that, so I'm just going to Control Z, undo, and do it up top. And there we go. And you want it to be large enough that your character could actually fall into the hole or get into the hole when we have a cave. All right, so then I'm going to find my next lowest position on the other side for our way out of the cave. How about right about here? Something like that. That looks pretty good. And when I was experimenting with this, my initial instinct was, of course, to decorate around the entrances into the cave that we just made. But I found an alternative workflow that I think works much more efficiently for making caves. So let's do that. So we're actually going to do the ceiling first. And this trick hit me like an epiphany because originally I did the floor, I did the walls, I did the entrances and exits, and I was like, oh, the ceiling, this is going to be a pain in the butt. But then I had this idea, this crazy idea, and it worked out really well. And I realized it would have been way faster to do the ceiling first. So that's what we're going to do. So first, navigate back over to selection mode, and we're going to use the same assets that we started in episode 9 of this series. So if you're following along, you should have all of these. If not, you're going to have to download them from the spreadsheet. And you can find these under Megascans and then into 3D Assets into the Earth quadrant under our main palette here. And what we're going to do is all of the three-dimensional rocks, meaning all the rocks that have surfaces on all 3 dimensions, we're going to use those as our ceiling. And that's our Earth rock 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, if you don't have foliage assets already created for these, you're going to need to create foliage assets for them. But even if you do have foliage assets, like I do here from episode 9, I'm still going to duplicate all of these foliage assets. So right-click, duplicate. And the reason for this is only going to become apparent in our following episode, but it'll make sense then. So I'm just going to rename each of these. So it's going to be Earth Rock 5, Cave Ceiling. And same thing with all the rest. So Earth Rock 1, Cave Ceiling. So if you've got all that, rocks 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, then what we're going to do is into foliage mode. Go back to our content drawer. We'll take all of those, drag them into our palette. So now we set our brush size to how about 4000. Paint density we'll keep 0.5. Make sure you've got these 3 checked. Landscape, static meshes, BSP. I think we only actually need landscape checked, but check all 3 just to be safe. And so now I'm going to go ahead and select all of these. So select check. And we're going to keep the same settings that we set up in episode 9. We're just going to change a few things. So density, we're going to move this down to 10. The align max angle here, I'm going to set this to 30 degrees. In the ground slope angle, we want these to be painted even if the mountain's very steep. So I'm going to crank this up to 90. Now, here's the magic, and here's the epiphany that came to me. So I thought to myself, what if we just change the Z offset? So instead of being slightly embedded into the ground, the rocks are actually under the ground. So basically what we're doing is we're setting the cave ceiling to be directly underneath the surface of the landscape. So I'm going to set the Z offset minimum to -200, max to -200. And this way they're at an even level directly underneath our landscape. And the other reason that this works so well is that all these rocks, based on what we set up in episode 9, they're all scaled to be roughly around the same size. But then again, if the sizing's a little bit off, it just means that the rock is going to be sticking out of the landscape. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Entirely up to you. And so now I'm just going to zoom out a little and we are ready to paint our ceiling of our cave. And I'm just going to do it over the entire mountain area. And if I come down, so right about here, you see, so it's completely covering the underbelly of our landscape. And so if I go under that, that's going to be our ceiling. And we see there, we actually have some holes that, well, I didn't paint so thoroughly. So I'm just going to come out the other side, paint a little bit more thoroughly there. And you can always crank up the density as well if you like. So now on to our cave floors. So for that, I'm going to get out of foliage mode. We'll go back to selection. And this is where we're going to use the tundra formations that I mentioned earlier. So back in our Earth quadrant, I put those under massive tundra here. These 4. And let's go into the first one here. And I'll just pull this directly into the level because what I want to do for this, actually, let me rotate it a little bit. So W and E are my 2 favorite keyboard shortcuts here. So E switches over to rotation mode and then W switches over to being able to transform it. So you'll notice with these rock formations that it has this part that's kind of directly next to a cliff here. And so I was thinking this would be a nice walkway. So the cliff would actually serve as kind of a wall going into the cave. And then this would be a walkway going into the cave. And then it opens up to kind of a giant cave in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this accordingly. So I'm just going to change the rotation a little bit, move it into position, and set it up on the beach side here. And you want to set it to be low enough such that it gets under the roof. But we're going to clean up the entries, obviously. And then what I'm going to do is Control C, Control V to paste, E to rotate, and we're going to rotate it 180 degrees around and move that over into position. You want it to basically blend in with the other one. Yeah, so if you've got a walkway that looks very similar to this, what I'll probably do is move it up slightly. And if you're not getting your viewport here, auto adjusting the brightness when you go underneath the cave, then just make sure you have a post-process volume here. That's probably your issue. All right, so if you got all this, if that's looking good, then we just got to populate the rest of our cave. So our other exit out, let me just see if that lines up. Yeah, so it's all the way over here. So what I might do, let's go back over to foliage mode, make sure to select everything, go to erase, and let's change the brush size down to maybe like 200 now. And if I zoom out a little bit, then I should be able to, actually, I think I gotta make it a little bit larger so that it encompasses the underground space, maybe about 800. Come up here a little bit. Yep, there we go. And let's do the same thing on the other side, but instead of using our first one here, let's use our last one. So drag this in. Got to move over to selection mode. And you want it roughly pointed to the other entrance exit, wherever that is. So something like that should do. Move it over a little bit, blend it in. And then we'll do the same thing where we'll copy it and we'll flip it and move it over. You want it so that at first glance, you cannot tell where one starts and the other ends. All right, so now we just got to finish out the interior of our cave here, which shouldn't be all that difficult because it's really just the middle. So for that, now I'm going to pull in my other two massive tundra rock formations. And for this, just use your best judgment, you know, whatever you think is appropriate. So I'm just going to move this over. We'll sculpt this out. And one thing to watch out for is you might get some of these where they stick out and it's only got one side. So you could either sculpt your landscape around that, or we're just going to reposition this slightly. Shouldn't need to reposition it much, just tilt it slightly in one direction or another. And that should solve it. Now, if you get something like this here, so that is so closely aligned with our landscape that what I'm just going to do is raise up our landscape slightly. Move this to a brush size of 500 and raise it up, raise it up. And if you get any sudden drop-offs here, like I do here, like I want this part of the cave to actually be pretty deep, because next episode we're going to do Niagara fluids, and I want a pool of standing water at the bottom of our cave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our cliff here and move it directly up against that kind of jarring edge there. And then we can duplicate it again, rotate it, move it over here. And I should also add, you could change the scale of these. So I'm going to make this one 1.2, 1.2, 1.2. What do you think? Pretty solid cave. So I think we're ready to test this. So to test this, I'm just going to right click and say play from here all the way on the edge of the landscape. And when you do that, before you jump in, just make sure you've got collision set up for all of these meshes, and away we go. And here's our cave. And because I set up the physical material on each of these meshes, or actually I set up the physical material on each of the materials of the meshes, then it's like I'm stepping on stone because of our footsteps we set up in episode 19. The one other thing to make sure or try to do is, and you could test this by getting a plane into your level, is we want something basically in the middle of the cave, a very low area, and that's where the water is going to be next episode. So I'm going to make this, let's do scale of 30, 30, and 1, totally fine. Lower it down, down, down. And if you got an area like that, like an area that's perfect for a little pool of water, right like that, that's totally fine. So now it's time to do our entrances and exits. And I'm going to start with the one that's at beach level here. And the very first thing is you'll notice that I've got some rocks that are kind of cluttering up where I want the entrance to be. So what I'm going to do is into foliage mode, make sure to select all of them, check, and then go to erase and set your brush size to be a little bit larger than the whole. I guess 800 is fine here. And then back over to selection mode, because for the entrances and exits, I'm just going to use static meshes. Now back in episode 14, we had an asset that was titled Mossy Chapel Arch. So the beachside entrance to this cave, I'm going to have be man-made with this particular asset, and on the other side, it's going to be more of a natural entrance. So I'm going to drag in this static mesh, and I'm just going to scale it up quite a bit. So it's going to be 1.5, 1.5, and 1.5. Rotate it accordingly, and actually move it in a little bit further than the edge of the landscape, and you'll see why. And actually, I'm going to scale it up even further. So it's going to be 2 by 2 and keep the height 1.5 or maybe like 1.6, just a little bit higher. And because this is raised where I have it here, I'm actually going to bring it in a little bit further. Yeah, something like right about there. And then also from that same episode, episode 14, we're going to use our stairs. We use these castle stairs for our Roman courtyard. So I'll drag that in. And again, rotate it to be in position. Don't worry about the coloring at this stage. We're going to fix that. And again, I'm going to make this slightly larger. 1.2, 1.2, 1.2. Let's see how it looks from this side. Yeah, I'll just rotate it up slightly. Maybe we just do a test play just to make sure that our character can fit through the entrance. Yeah, so if you get this problem here, then what we got to do is we got to go into the mesh, and then same thing we did with the other assets. So collision, and then change the collision complexity here from project default to use complex collision as simple, and that should do it. Let's test again. Yep, so far so good. You can run right through. Perfect. So now I'm just going to clean up our landscape a little bit. And this is really the most time-consuming part of this, is getting the edges just right. So for visibility, reduce this down to maybe like 40. Yeah, just cut that, cut this, and I can hold shift and I can bring back the part up top. Yeah, so a little bit up there I think is totally fine. And now what we're going to do is we're going to line all the rest of the landscape with static meshes. So back to selection mode, and we're going to go back to Megascans, 3D assets under our Earth quadrant, main palette. And typically what I recommend here is start off with your largest assets. So the Nordic boulder, move that in, so that's gigantic. I'm going to change the rotation to pretty much match as a wall. That's looking pretty good, but the problem is now I got this side all sticking out just like that. So you could solve that one of two ways. You can move your landscape up in this area, or we could just cover that with other meshes. So I think I'm just going to do that. So now we just got a little green moss growing on that one. All right, so now for the top. So typically I like doing a big flat rock for the top. So I'm going to scale this one up to 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. Maybe rotate it accordingly. Actually, let's flip it around. I'm going to cut out the landscape here just slightly. Now on to the other side. So let's pick one of our other tundra boulders. I know it's tundra, I'm just saying tundra. Maybe scale this up a little bit. Let's do 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. So that's looking pretty good. So now we could do the same kind of thing with other rock formations. So let's see. How about this boulder? Gonna make this one a little bit bigger. It's pretty big already, but... And you don't have to take care of the entire edge with a single rock. So I'm gonna use this for the top here, but then for the bottom, like even this one again, and we could just scale it to be a lot smaller, and I bet it'll take care of the problem just fine. And then I'll have another rock next to it. So last thing, we gotta do this area here, and I've got the perfect one for that. Tundra rock formation. It kind of just fades right into the beach, right? And into the stairs. The thing is, I got to raise the beach slightly, but that's not a problem. So we just come to landscape, maybe make this slightly bigger, 200, and raise it up. Back to selection mode, and we're just going to go inside, and we'll do the same thing with the interior here. So if you're looking around from the inside and you don't see any holes, if everything's looking good, just like that, then you're all set. So now let's go on to the other side. And this one, we're gonna do all natural. So to start, I'm gonna make this hole a bit bigger. And then I leave it up to you. Go to town. The one thing I do recommend is choose a flat rock, something like this for the way down. You don't have to do that. You could have it be bumpy, but here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make it like 3 by 3 by 3. And this is the VIV RCJKAW. And you could even use a few of these. So I'll duplicate it and spin this one around. And I think I'm just going to duplicate it one more time and put that all the way down to the bottom. Same with this one. Now that we got that, let's just finish out the edges. Once you got something looking like that, and you check the outside as well, play from here. Yep, looking pretty good. So now let's go back over to the other entrance of the cave, because we need to fix the coloring of the archway and the stairs over here. So right now they do not match. So let's select the archway and let's go into the material. And specifically, let's go into the texture here. So I'm going to change it so the saturation is 0.3 and the RGB curve is 1.5. Yeah, it just matches the rocks much more closely. And we'll do the same kind of thing with the stairs. So we'll go into that material, over to the texture, saturation 0.7 and RGB curve 1.5. Save that. Yeah, that's looking a little bit grayer, a little bit grimier. So now on to the last thing before lighting. Now it's really up to you whether or not you want to do this, but I really like the idea of having the god rays shining into the cave. So what we're going to do is I'm going to find the highest point of the cave, like right about here. I'm going to go back into our foliage painting mode, and then I'm going to zoom out right at that point. And I found that in order to reach any of the rocks, we need to set a brush size to probably about 800. I know that's pretty big, but then let's erase. So now we've got a hole. So now that we've got a hole, we can switch over to the landscape mode, and we got to do the same thing here. So brush size, set it to about 100, and yep, there we go. And then back in our content drawer under Megascans, I'm going to search for arch and get our Mossy Chapel arch once again. And this is entirely up to you. You could do something totally different. But what I found to look pretty cool is we're going to put two of these arches kind of up against each other. And I'm just going to scale this up 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. And you'll see what this looks like. You want it as close to the landscape as you can. And then we'll duplicate it and swing it around. You'll see where I'm going with this. Yeah, so basically just large enough for the character to go through. So let's test that. So can I jump through it? And now you know what to do around the edges. So Earth Quadrant, main palette. Test play one more time. Bombs away. Oh. Ooh, it's gonna leave a mark. So now we got to do the interior, right? So same kind of thing. And for this, honestly, I think I'm just gonna use one kind of rock. It'll get the job done just fine. And I thought about making additional holes for light shafts, but in the interest of time, I think that's all we're going to do this episode. So if you want to do more, feel free. So now on to lighting. We're saving the best for last, and I want to give a special shout out to Clyde and the guys from the Discord that helped me finally start to understand this. And my first tip with lighting is the best tool out there for managing it. It's under Window. It's called the Environmental Light Mixer right here. And it's going to pop up this window on your screen just like this. I suggest changing this from minimal to normal to follow along. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make it smaller so that it's a single pane, and we'll scroll through the entire thing and you can see how it's going to change our lighting as we go through it. So I'll make this basically the size of our details panel. And what the Environmental Light Mixer does is it basically combines all the key actors that affect lighting in your scene into a single place to manage it. I think the only exception to this is the post-process volume, but I'll show you how to adjust that afterwards. So the directional light, that's our sunlight. We're not going to mess with that for now. I'm going to scroll down. The skylight is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically the atmospheric light that's radiating from the sun, from the directional light. And we're also not going to mess with that for now. Sky atmosphere determines how that skylight actually radiates, so what comprises our atmosphere such that the light looks the way it looks. And a lot of this stuff is pretty advanced. Just know that it's already got Earth-like settings built in, so unless you want your world to look otherworldly, I wouldn't really change anything here. So below that, we've got volumetric clouds, and these are the clouds that are up in the sky. Not really going to mess with that this episode since we're focused on indoor lighting. And for indoor lighting, I figure the first thing to go over is God rays, because that's what's on everybody's mind. So there's two ways to get God rays, and one is based on looking at the actual source of the light, so looking straight up at it. And the second is through exponential height fog, and specifically through making our exponential height fog volumetric fog, so checking this checkbox here. I'm going to uncheck it for now. We're going to come back to it because let's first get the God rays working when looking at the light source. So for that, I'm going to come back up to my directional light. And what's going to control that is the light shaft bloom. So check this checkbox, and immediately you should get the God rays if you're looking at the light source. So let me zoom out for a moment because let me show you something. So you can hit Control L to get the ability to change where your sun is. So I'm just holding Control after I hit Control L, and then I move with my mouse and I can control the direction of my sun. And releasing Control then releases the sun. So I'll do Control L again. I'm just going to put the sun directly overhead for the purposes of this demonstration. So now because I've checked off light shaft bloom, then I got our God rays. However, if I'm not looking at the light, so if I turn away, then I don't have the God rays. So in order to get permanent God rays that are always there, that's where we're going to have to use, under exponential height fog, the volumetric fog. But let's just go back to the light shaft bloom because I want to talk about the settings there. So the bloom scale. Okay, let's look back at our light. So if we want this to be really intense, we can up our bloom scale. So I can up. And the bloom tint. So let's say your sun is like a much darker, redder sun. So we could make that tint quite a lot darker, quite a lot redder. And you could play with some of the other settings like the occlusion settings, so they're going to determine how the rest of your scene looks relative to the light shaft. But those two settings, the light shaft bloom and then the bloom scale, those are really the two key settings to get it working when you're looking at the light. But now let's get it working in general. Let's get a light just generally filtering into our cave. So we'll come down to our exponential height fog. And by the way, if you're missing any of these actors in the world, at the top of your environmental light mixer, it'll give you options to add those to your scene. And you can also just drag them in by searching for them up here. And the first setting we need is volumetric fog. So select that. And let me just move this up a little bit and over so you could see it. All right, so we got our volumetric fog turned on, but we don't got a light shaft yet. And why is that? Well, the first thing we can do is we can up our fog density quite a bit. So let's up at 10% fog density up here to 0.2. And now we start having a light shaft there. But there are things that we can do to increase it even more, because as we up our fog density, let me just show you outside. So when I go outside, now we see fog. So back inside our level, okay, we got the start of our God ray. If we want to increase the intensity of this, let's raise our extinction scale here. Raise it to 10. So between those two settings, that's what I found to work the best. So our extinction scale goes up and our fog density as well goes up. So if I set this to 0.02, then we have a very thin fog, but we still have a pretty strong beam because this is set to such a high value. So the albedo, this is going to control the tint of the actual light beam. So if I set this to like blue, purple, then we have a purple beam. And then the emissive here, so this is actually going to be the color of the fog itself. So here's what I mean. So as it's black, we don't even see the fog in our cave. But if I select this and then I up this to white, yeah, even a little bit, all of a sudden you start seeing the fog. And you can also change the tint of this too. So you can change it to like, let's make a subtle green. That looks like a perfect horror movie scene right there. Just got to be a little bit darker. So those are the key settings that I found to make God rays, but let's go over one more thing, which is the brightness of your overall cave here. And for that, we just got to go into our post-process volume and we could search for brightness. And you'll find this under lens exposure here. We got our minimum and maximum brightness. Now, if you want to reduce the overall light level in the cave, then raise this minimum brightness. So I don't really understand these lens settings all that much, but raising this to something like 0.4, yeah, we got a much darker, much more natural looking cave. And I like having the combination of a little bit of a God ray, but when you look at it, you get the full effect. Yeah, so it's just a nice blend of the two effects. The other thing I should mention here is we set up a post-process volume back in episode 43 on our third person character. So this was under functions, post-process, set post-process dynamic material instance. It was right here. So I wanted to mention that I landed on a setting for minimum brightness of 0.5, and then also maximum brightness, I cranked that up all the way to 8.0. And the reason I did that is because the minimum and the maximum brightness makes a big difference whether you're outside or inside. So if the maximum brightness was closer to 1 or 2, then it was really bright outside, especially on the beach. But we have the opposite problem in the cave, because if the minimum brightness is set to too high, then I'm not going to be able to see anything in the cave. So you got to play with those settings, make sure you get them right. So the very last thing we're going to do as part of this episode is make sure our AI can run into and out of the cave. So we're going to start that by adding a nav mesh to our scene. So that's one word, nav mesh bounds volume, and we could just add it in. I'm going to zoom out because I'm going to change the scale of this to roughly match what our level is. So this is going to be, let's do 50, 50, and 10. And we see our nav mesh there, but let's increase that. So 150, 150, and 50. And there we go. Now it's comprising the entire island. And in order to see that nav mesh, just press P on your keyboard. And then it shows up green all over your level, just like that. And what you want to look for, the key to look for, is right here. So depending on the size of the entrance into the cave, the nav mesh might not connect automatically. So it's fine in the cave, but it's really those entrances and exits. So let me show you how to solve that problem. So if we search for recast nav mesh right here, and if we scroll down, we've got to go to a setting that's our agent radius. If I decrease this down from 35 down to 5, that's basically resizing the size of our AI. So then based on the smaller size of our agent, our AI character, then our AI should be able to navigate in. So I'm just going to drag in a reference to my AI, drag in a character. And once I got the AI in the level, I can just right click, play from here. AI should be following me. Let's see if it can follow me into the cave. Yep. Now, one thing I found is that exiting out of the editor and coming back in, all those recast nav mesh settings don't save. And so searching for that problem, I found this post here. Recast nav mesh does not save when editing properties. And here's the answer. This problem could be fixed by adding a new supported agent to the navigation system in project settings. So we'll navigate over to settings. We'll go under project settings. And if I come down a little bit to navigation system, and we can add a supported agent. So plus sign here. Expand this, and I'm going to change the nav agent radius to 5. And I don't know what this controls, but our character can crouch, can jump, and can walk, so I'm going to select all 3. So then we'll save this and restart the engine. So that wraps up our episode for today. And in our next episode, I figure it's about time to make our water completely interactable. So I hope to see you there in the next episode.